War on Earth. Modern Times, 1936, was the last great movie of the silent era, and the final outing for Charlie Chaplin's globally beloved everyman character, the Little Tramp. Amid the deepest economic crisis of the modern era, Chaplin parodied how the factory assembly line crushed the human soul. Rarely seen as a film with an ecological subtext, Modern Times is an indelible artistic statement on how human nature and the material world were misshapen by machinery in the 2 decades after the First World War. The film's opening juxtaposes sheep with human beings, as if to show that all forms of life were being turned into automata by the doctrine of efficiency. A scene of sheep being herded through a narrow passage on an industrial farm blurs into a crowd of faceless, hat-wearing men exiting a subway station. There is a lone black sheep among the flock, portent of how Little Tramp will stand out, an agent of glorious chaos amid the mass of industrial workers. The mechanized slaughter of the First World War awakened writers and artists in Europe and America, and across the colonized world, to ask where the fevered pursuit of wealth and power would ultimately lead. But their call for precaution was only ever the view of a minority. The post-war years witnessed not a slowing down, but a speeding up. The technological innovations of wartime, beginning with the much augmented use of the internal combustion engine and extending to the new view of the Earth that came with aerial shots in motion pictures, shattered limits to how far people could travel and what machines could do. By 1929, there were more than 27 million cars on America's roads, one for every household. No other country came close. On a visit to Ford's factory in Detroit, Chaplin heard stories of workers who had suffered nervous breakdowns under relentless pressure to produce more. Chaplin reflected on what mass production meant for human autonomy. In 1931, as the economic boom of 1920s gave way to mass unemployment, Chaplin met Mahatma Gandhi in London, in a humble little house in the slum district off the East India Dock Road. Chaplin asked about Gandhi's abhorrence of machinery. Gandhi replied, "Machinery in the past has made us dependent on England, and the only way we can rid ourselves of that dependency is to boycott all goods made by machinery." Gandhi's concern was for the living planet, as well as for political freedom. God forbid that India should ever take to industrialization in the manner of the West. He had written in 1928, "For if an entire nation of 300 million took to similar economic exploitation, it would strip the world bare like locusts." Few among Gandhi's fellow nationalists in India, including Jawaharlal Nehru, the Mahatma's protege among the younger leaders, agreed with him. What India needed, many of them thought, was what British rule had blocked: an industrial revolution. Both his visit to Ford factory and his meeting with Gandhi left an impression on Chaplin as he plotted the Tramp's swan song. In Modern Times, the Little Tramp goes to work on an assembly line. A wrench in each hand, he tightens bolts. Chaplin revels in physical comedy as the conveyor belt moves faster and faster, leaving the tramp flailing to keep up. And then the hapless tramp is chosen by the factory manager to try out a new contraption: the Billows feeding machine, designed to feed workers automatically so that they could keep working through lunch. The machine goes awry and assaults the tramp with a corn cob. In its absurdity, the feeding machine embodies the industrial worker's final alienation from eating as a communal activity and from food as a product of the soil. The tramp is driven to the limits of his sanity and starts assaulting his fellow workers. Thrown out of the factory, he finds work as a singing waiter. In the final scene, Little Tramp and his love, the Garmin, played by Chaplin's wife, Paulette Goddard, are shown walking toward distant hills on a stretch of open road. It is not quite an escape from modern times. The road and the factory are bound together after all, but the happy ending shows the couple's re-engagement with the natural world, with the land and the open sky after the unnatural hell of the factory. All was not well on the open American road by the time of Chaplin's film. In 1936, the Great Plains suffered from severe drought for the second time in 3 years. Grasslands revolted, having been ploughed up by generations of settlers for wheat, a crop ill-adapted to the arid conditions. Ferocious winds whipped up eroded topsoil, flinging dust storms toward the cities of the East Coast. Crops withered. Farm families embarked on another great migration west. A new generation of agricultural economists and soil scientists brought into the Department of Agriculture under FDR's New Deal diagnosed deeper ills. A 1936 report submitted to President Roosevelt, The Future of the Great Plains, presented the Dust Bowl as the inexorable result of settler expansion, and above all as the outcome of the notion that nature could be conquered as if in a war. The hope for the future was that the land may bloom again if man once more makes his peace with nature. Historian and sociologist Lewis Mumford expressed optimism that the right lessons would be learned, that instead of exploitation by mere spread and plunder, a stable and orderly culture of the earth and its resources will take its place. The decade to follow would be neither stable nor peaceful. Built upon fragile compromises after the First World War, the global order collapsed in the 1930s. The Great Depression shook the foundation of transatlantic capitalism and emboldened the Soviet alternative of forced industrialization. The accompanying rush to collective farming scattered a wreckage of famine across Ukraine. To slacken the pace would mean to lag behind, and those who lag behind are beaten, Joseph Stalin declared in 1931. We have lagged behind the advanced countries by 50 to 100 years. We must cover that distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or we will go under. Germany, Japan, and Italy tore up international agreements that brought them little benefit. Surveying the possibilities before them, German, Japanese, and Italian leaders understood only too well how thoroughly the 19th century British Empire had reshaped the earth, seizing, deploying, and exploiting the products of nature on a planetary scale. We have got most of the world already, or the best parts of it, a British naval commander admitted amid the rising tensions of the 1930s. We only want to keep what we have got and prevent others from taking it away from us. The era of expansion has come to an end, sociologist Lewis Mumford declared of the US West. But as latecomers to the Imperial game, what the Axis powers sought was another great transformation, another redistribution of both people and nature. It would come at inhuman cost. The notion of Lebensraum, living space, obsessed Nazi ideologues even before they seized power in 1933. Friedrich Ratzel, who coined the term in a 1901 essay, was a pioneer of biogeography. He understood modern states as akin to natural organisms in pursuit of living space, each haunted by Thomas Robert Malthus's early 19th century vision of a perpetual struggle for room and food. Anxiety about land and sustenance became a self-fulfilling spur to imperial expansion. Nature knows no political boundaries, Adolf Hitler had declared in Mein Kampf. First she places living creatures on this globe and watches the free play of forces. Richard Walter Darré, Minister of Food and Agriculture in the Nazi government, insisted on Germany's need to break the binding limits of its territory. The natural area for the settlement by the German people, he said, is the territory to the east of the Reich's boundaries up to the Urals. In a 1936 speech, Darré boasted, "We will settle this space, according to the law that a superior people always has the right to conquer and own the land of an inferior people." This was a view that straightforwardly defined how every European empire had justified its expansion. A comparable fear of ecological limits motivated the Japanese search for new soils and new resources in mainland China. The critical problem of population and foodstuffs seems all without solution. The Japanese Kwantung Army's commanders noted to justify their annexation of Manchuria in 1931. Philosopher Watsuji Tetsuro penned a treatise on climate and culture in the 1930s, insisting that the submissive and resignatory peoples of tropical lands were crying out for Japanese imperial domination in order to set this teeming power, the power of earth and atmosphere, in motion. The Nazi regime made repeated references to the environmental history of the 19th century, to the claiming of the world by Anglo-American settlement, which had left the Reich no choice. The Nazis believed but to replicate that history of expansion in Eurasia. Darré's own early life had been spent in a land of settler opportunity, underwritten by British investment and protected by British gunboats. He grew up in Buenos Aires, Argentina, the port through which the grasslands of the Pampas filled the empire with refrigerated beef. Nazi proponents of blood and soil invoked the medieval colonization of the lands beyond the Elbe by German-speaking peoples. But America always loomed large in their imagination. Frederick Jackson Turner's theory of the American frontier, of westward expansion as a national destiny, reverberated through German intellectual circles. Germany's version of the American West lay to the east. Heinrich Himmler imagined a future in which German settlers had at last subdued the endless primeval forest of Eastern Europe and made there a paradise, a European California. Hitler himself insisted on the need to set about the Germanization of the land by bringing in Germans and to regard the indigenous inhabitants as Indians. What that would mean for Eastern Europe's inhabitants did not need spelling out. For decades, German novels and popular histories celebrating the exterminatory violence of American settlers had found an enthusiastic audience. Without quite the open admiration the Nazis had for the total annihilation of native populations, Japanese planners saw Manchuria in comparable terms. Like the colonial days in American history, a new state is in the making. The vast virgin plains, unhampered by tradition, ready to welcome armies of fresh immigrants. Global war began not in Europe, but in Asia. On July 7, 1937, a minor skirmish at the Marco Polo Bridge in Beijing led to a full-scale Japanese invasion of China. The international order strained and then snapped. On September 1, 1939, having secured a pact with the Soviet Union a month earlier, German forces invaded Poland. Within months, much of Western Europe was under German control. In 1940, Japanese forces moved into Indochina after it came under the control of the Nazi-installed Vichy regime in France. Japan was now within striking reach of British and Dutch-controlled regions of Southeast Asia. The decisive worldwide escalation came in 1941. On June 22nd, Hitler invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa, and then on December 7th and 8th, the Japanese Army and Navy simultaneously attacked Pearl Harbor and launched an invasion of Southeast Asia. Within 3 months, Japanese forces had conquered Malaya, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, Indonesia, and the Philippines. It took Allied forces 6 months to regroup and recover from the stunning Axis advance. The balance of military power was shifted most of all by the entry of the United States. By the end of 1942, the fortunes of war had changed. Though the war dragged on to wreak another 2.5 years of murder and destruction, the German army's defeat at Stalingrad and the Japanese Navy's defeat by American forces at the Battle of Midway gave the Allies a decisive advantage. Like the First, the Second World War was waged by workers rushing to make more guns, more aircraft, and more steel with the rock and metal, the coal and oil grabbed from every corner of the earth. It was a war against nature, described in the language of natural forces. When the war began, it was as if the environmental history of the previous 150 years had been concentrated and ignited. The transformations of a century were reenacted, this time scattered and compressed into less than a decade. Millions of people and their animals moved to cultivate lands on the margins of habitability. Geologists scrabbled for minerals and put miners to work ever deeper underground. Armies of labourers hacked roads into mountainsides and felled woods for rail tracks. In the Soviet Union, workers and soldiers packed up and moved 2,600 factories, piece by piece, across the Urals. Again, belligerent powers scoured the ends of the earth for raw materials to fight the war. Iron ore came from the mines of Kiruna and Gällivare in Swedish Lapland, from Algeria and Newfoundland and Sierra Leone. Bauxite for aluminium came from the mines of British Guiana, controlled by the Canadian corporation Alcan. Oil came overwhelmingly from the United States and Mexico, but also from Iraq, invaded by British forces in 1941, and from Iran, divided into spheres of influence by Britain and the Soviet Union. The quest for destruction reshaped even human bodies. In the 1970s, Belarusian journalist Svetlana Alexievich interviewed Soviet women who had fought in the Second World War. One of them, V. Gromova, a medical assistant, told her, "I have enough metal in me. I carry a fragment from a wound I received near Vitebsk in my lung. within an inch of my heart, a second fragment in the right lung, 2 in the region of the stomach. The war forced together 2 changes in the human relationship to the rest of nature that had played out over the 19th century. The first, within reach only of a privileged minority, was a revolution in the capacity to preserve, protect, and extend life, to thwart the newly visible pathogens that threatened human survival, to forestall decay and optimize every landscape for human flourishing. The second, both marker and maker of inequality, was a revolution in killing, a heightened capacity that the most powerful nations had to destroy human, animal, and vegetal life. The sense that humans were an exception to the laws of nature had built slowly and partially over centuries and had grown more forceful in the 19th century age of industrialization and empire. Yet amid the horrors of war, society seemed to revert. So many observers noted to a state of nature, as state after state collapsed from 1942 to 1945. Any lingering sense of human mastery over nature dissolved into fear. First and last, there was the struggle for food. The Nazi leadership understood that the oldest and most basic form of human ecological control over the land and its produce, would decide the outcome of the war. Hitler described the struggle in May 1942. It is a battle for food, a battle for the basis of life, for the raw materials the earth offers, the natural resources that lie under the soil and the fruits that it offers to the one who cultivates it. As soon as it became clear that the war would be prolonged, Germany's ability to fight rested on food from occupied lands. Grain, grain, and grain again is how one Nazi regional leader summed up what Germany needed from the annexed areas of Poland. Anxiety about grain, alongside Hitler's fantasy of an inevitable showdown with Bolshevism, spurred the decision to invade the Soviet Union in 1941. Led by agricultural expert Herbert Back, more grimly effective than Daré, the Nazis set out a scheme to plunder the East. The Hunger Plan, formulated early in 1941, turned food into a weapon. To secure grain for the Reich, the Nazis decided that Slavic peoples should starve. German forces would cut food supplies from Ukraine to Russia's towns and cities and use it to feed the Wehrmacht. General Georg Thomas, shaper of the Hunger Plan, predicted in May 1941 that umpteen millions of people would doubtless starve to death. Back was more precise. That number would be 30 million people. It was the most naked plan for mass murder by starvation in human history. At every step, it was a struggle for environmental control. The strength of Soviet resistance wrecked the Nazis' systematic plan. What occurred instead were countless local famines, each driven by the same brutal calculations that had assembled the Hunger Plan as a whole. The ferocity of the German assault on the land killed everything on it. Within 150 kilometers of the front, requisitioning was so comprehensive that it left behind an ecological dead zone, without a single food plant growing, without an animal left alive. During the wartime occupation, German forces appropriated an estimated 9 million tons of grain from the Soviet Union, an amount equivalent to the pre-war consumption of 12 million Soviet citizens over a span of 3 years. What German forces could not seize, they strangled. The siege of Leningrad, which lasted for 872 days, killed 1 million people. Official propaganda upheld an image of Leningrad as a Soviet Troy, defended by impeccably heroic inhabitants wholly dedicated to the manufacture of weapons and tanks for the war effort. Testimonies of suffering had little place in this story of resilience, and only decades later did the searing wartime work of Leningrad poets come to light. Soldier poet Sergei Rudakov, who would die in battle a year after he wrote these lines, depicts city streets emptied of life. On the streets there's quite a chill. Wherever you look, they're dragging sleds of sorrowful remains, sewn into the white of linen. The row of frozen mummies slides along. Rudakov conveys the hope that life will return, that this too would pass, coupled with stoic resignation that the cycle of death all around him is a pattern in the sweep of human history. In this world, everything repeats. The Nazis' racial ideology infused every decision they made about the distribution of food. "If anyone has to go hungry, it shall not be the Germans, but other peoples," Hermann Goering declared in August 1942. The war was being fought, chief propagandist Joseph Goebbels wrote, so that the German people could enjoy a well-laid breakfast, lunch and dinner table. With most German men of fighting age already conscripted, the Nazis' vision of who would eat and who would starve clashed with their need for workers. Millions of people were forced from the East to work in the German war economy, and their labour was so vital that the Military Economic Office of the Wehrmacht urged pragmatism. The concepts of normal labour, heavy labour, and extra heavy labour have to be regarded in objective terms, independent of racial consideration, as a throughput of calories and muscular effort. The science of human nutrition was reduced to a cruel essence. What was the minimal intake of calories compatible with toil? If essential workers had to receive scarce food to remain productive, it became even more important for the Nazis to identify those they called useless eaters, unnütze Esser, who would receive none. The Nazis' use of starvation as a means of waging war set the stage for the singular horror that faced Europe's Jewish people. Anti-Semitism was at the poisoned core of the Nazi ideology from the start, inciting pogroms, expulsions, discriminatory laws, and internment of Germany's Jewish population. In a speech to the German parliament on January 30, 1939, Hitler had predicted the annihilation of Europe's Jews in the event of global war. Local atrocities piled up as soon as war broke out. The systematic murder of Jewish people escalated after the German attack on the Soviet Union, carried out in village after village by Einsatzgruppen death squads. The genocidal impulse went beyond committed Nazi cadres. Walter von Reichenau, a Wehrmacht field commander, told the soldiers of his 6th Army in the fall of 1941 that they were the carrier of an inexorable racial conception and the avenger of all bestialities which had been committed against the Germans. He sought their complete understanding in pursuing the harsh but just atonement of Jewish subhumanity. Starvation accompanied every step toward genocide. As the camps began their ghastly work of extermination, Jewish people throughout the occupied East were denied all rations. In the Nazis' murderous logic, the two kinds of killing presented as alternatives. In July 1941, Rolf Heinz Hoppner, who served the security police in Wartland, part of the territory annexed from Poland, wrote to the SS officer, key orchestrator of the Holocaust, Adolf Eichmann, "It should be seriously considered whether it would not be the most humane solution to finish off the Jews that are unfit for work through some fast-acting means. In any case, this would be more agreeable than to let them starve to death." By the middle of 1942, 100,000 Jewish people in Vaterland had been murdered, and grain exports to Germany sped up. Historian Adam Tooze concludes that there was, in the end, no grand contradiction between economics and ideology within the regime. Rather, there was a perverse functional connection between the elimination of the Jewish population of the East, where most victims of the genocide lived and died, and the German scramble to feed an army of forced labour. Within the camps, the manipulation and withholding of food did the ideological work of rendering life stripped bare of its humanness. In his indelible memoir of Auschwitz, Italian chemist and writer Primo Levi describes how the prison guards and eventually the prisoners themselves used the German word fressen, not essen, for eating. This way of eating on our feet, furiously burning our mouths and throats without time to breathe, really is fressen, the way of eating animals, and certainly not essen, the human way of eating, seated in front of a table, religiously. Nazi ideology projected a view of human beings as pure biology, as instinct-driven herds, races, in a struggle to attain the conditions of life. At the same time, the Nazi worldview also held that some human life, Aryan German life, was uniquely sacred. Here lies the significance of Reichenau's appeal to bestiality and subhumanity, or of Heinrich Himmler's declaration a year and a half later that anti-Semitism is exactly the same as delousing. Their depraved worldview was so riven with inconsistency that many senior Nazi leaders were known for their acute sensitivity to, even love for, non-human animals, a trait they upheld as a mark of authentic Germanness. Himmler's chilling conclusion on April 24, 1943, "We shall soon be deloused. We have only 20,000 lice left. And then the matter is finished within the whole of Germany." The substance that the Nazis used to murder so many millions of people in the gas chambers of Auschwitz, Zyklon B, began life in the 1920s as a cyanide-based pesticide. Famines in Nazi-occupied Eastern Europe were the most orchestrated and the most brutal, but far from the only episodes of large-scale starvation during the Second World War. They were famines of siege, they were famines of state failure, famines of bungling and selective neglect. Each famine marked the collapse of control that human institutions could exert over the environment they depended on. In occupied Europe, Greece suffered most. When an Allied naval blockade stopped the arrival of food supplies in 1941, starvation followed. Food aid only began to arrive on neutral Swedish ships in late 1942. By that time, whole villages had emptied. In the Netherlands, where perceived racial affinity had led to less harsh treatment by the occupiers, German authorities finally placed an embargo on food in late 1944 in revenge for a rail strike and sporadic resistance attacks. The miserable season of deprivation that followed is still known in collective memory as the Hunger Winter. In Asia, the scale of suffering was greater still. In Bengal, in Henan, in Tonkin, and in Java. The war eroded the buffer already slim that cushioned people from the ordinary vicissitudes of rain and drought. Extreme weather was the immediate trigger of the wartime Asian famines, but it was not their root cause. In the winter of 1942, a cyclone struck eastern Bengal that, in violence and devastation, surpassed any other natural calamity that befell this country. Cyclonic winds and a storm surge combined to cause havoc. They swept the standing crops, blew off roofs, uprooted most of the trees, demolished the huts. 3/4 of the region's livestock perished. 2 years later, coastal Vietnam was battered by 3 successive typhoons, accompanied by a tidal wave that inundated 230,000 hectares of agricultural land. In the Chinese province of Henan and the Indonesian island of Java, the problem was not an excess of water, but rather its dearth. Drought parched Henan's fields in 1941-42. The region had barely recovered from the catastrophic floods of 1938, unleashed by Chiang Kai-shek's retreating forces when they breached the Yellow River dikes at Huaynukanu to stop the Japanese advance on Wuhan. Drought dried out riverbeds to make an ideal habitat for locust eggs. The locusts duly devoured a harvest already much diminished. Rain fell short of expectations in Java 2 years later, in 1944, confounding the strategies of cultivators who had cut back their production for fear that any surplus would end up in the hands of occupying Japanese forces. Each of these calamities wrecked farmland, flooded fields, drowned animals, and rotted stocks of grain. In normal times, the deficits would almost certainly have caused local hunger and deprivation, but not outright starvation. Supplies would have arrived, for each region of deficit traded with places of plenty. But supplies did not arrive for hungry people in Bengal and Henan, Tonkin and Java. Even reserves that had been built up locally were shipped out to feed armies far away. Every layer of protection that rural societies had fought to build up over generations was stripped away. Expecting a Japanese invasion from Arakan, British authorities in riverine Bengal seized the boats that cultivators used to move rice to market. When local officials raised the alarm about shortages, the British political leadership ignored them. Churchill bore deep resentment toward Gandhi and his Indian National Congress, who had rebelled and launched the Quit India movement in August 1942. He also expressed a common British racial hatred of India and Indians. Let them starve, Churchill said, if never as explicitly as the Nazis. The effect was the same. At the start of 1943, Churchill ordered a 60% reduction in shipping to the Indian Ocean. There is no reason why all parts of the British Empire should not feel the pinch in the same way as the mother country has done, he insisted. Throughout Bengal's catastrophe, British authorities continued to export the surplus grain of Punjab to other theatres of war. As market prices soared and food supplies dwindled, the most vulnerable members of Bengali society succumbed to starvation and illness. Worst off were people without land, people without incomes, and fishing communities whose boats were taken. In greatest peril across all these groups, just as during the famines of the late 19th century, were women and children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. Schoolmaster Bisveshwar Chakrabarti described the condition of his home village simply in a letter to the Bengali Relief Committee. The whole population seems to be moving silently towards death. In Vietnam and Java too, the exigencies of war turned government officials stony in the face of people's distress. Japanese commanders prioritized the war effort as the prospect of victory receded week by week, while their earlier insistence that farmers plant oilseeds and fibers at the expense of food crops had already left rural Javanese vulnerable. Even if the political will had been mustered, relief efforts in Vietnam would still have confronted a devastated infrastructure. Coastal shipping was menaced by Allied submarines. The Trans-Indo-Chinois Railway lay in tatters after repeated bombing by US forces, which destroyed bridges in Vinh, Yen Lai, Ninh Khoi, Yen Thai, Tan Hoa, Han Rong, Dolen, Ninh Binh, Phu Lai, and Hanoi. The French Indochina rail system, north from Vinh to the China border, the US military concluded, was attacked in strength and rendered largely unserviceable. Meat vanished first. People subsisted on stale rice, on good days spiced with eggplant and salt, and most of the time eaten with shreds of water, spinach, and some sweet potato. And then the rice, too, disappeared from the market. Nguyen Thi Chung, who was a girl of 10 at the time of the famine, recalled people's cruel mirages and vanished hopes in a time of catastrophe. Eat, hoping to ward off our hungry stomachs. Dry cakes pretending that they are rice dumplings filled with green bean paste. People slit open sweet potatoes and smeared them with ancient bran dregs to keep from wilting like swine. In China, with Henan haunted by starvation, a great exodus began. A planned resettlement of people organized by the embattled nationalist government resembled earlier eras of settler colonization, but was now compressed into just a few years. Around 50,000 people from Henan settled in the Huanglongshan region of Shaanxi. There they cut down trees and eked out plots from hillsides to grow potatoes, corn, and buckwheat. When the mountains erode and the rivers grow murky, an official warned, the harvests are not abundant and erosion problems occur. So great was the refugees' need, so desperate their quest for survival, that some local observers predicted that in 10 years, the denuded land would produce nothing. To render such colossal human suffering as statistics risks numbing the horror. Not to count the dead may be even worse, a prelude to forgetting. Between 2 and 3 million people perished in the Bengal famine of 1942 to 43. A further 2 million in Henan. 1 million Vietnamese died in the famine of 1944 to 45, and at least the same number of Javanese, if not more. Nowhere did more people die in wartime famines than in the Soviet Union, where the death toll was between 7 and 9 million people, between 6 and 7 million of them in German-occupied territory. In Greece, 300,000 people perished, around 5% of the entire population. 100,000 died in Austria, and up to 25,000 in the Netherlands' hunger winter. Nowhere are the numbers anything other than approximate. The struggle to compile them ever since the end of the war has led scholars and survivors to scour village records and local censuses, family memory and mass burial sites. To enumerate the dead has been a form of witness. Hunger left intergenerational scars. Nutritional research has shown that prenatal exposure to wartime famine in the Netherlands correlated in later life with lower body size and an increased incidence of both diabetes and schizophrenia. In Europe and Asia, communities survived by salvaging niches for growing plants in the midst of bombed-out cities and along their suburban edges. Urban gardeners had provisioned their fellow citizens through the First World War's food shortages. In the 1940s, an even larger number of people, and women most of all, turned to the land. "The soil is a bowl," a Russian proverb said. "What you put into it, you can take from it. Zemlya e tarelka, что получишь, то и возьмешь." Half of all American households cultivated backyard and neighborhood plots during the war. Even Boston Common and the White House gardens were turned to growing vegetables. The British Ministry of Agriculture announced the Dig for Victory campaign soon after the outbreak of war. By 1942, 1.6 million public allotments and more than 5 million domestic gardens supplied the British people. In the Soviet Union, more than anywhere else, kitchen gardens proved a lifeline. The pages of Pravda and the Communist Party's women's magazine, Rabotnitsa, were filled with columns of gardening advice. They instructed an eager reading public in using animal manure, ash, and turf to nourish the soil's fertility. Grow carrots, one columnist enjoined, for they were a whole pharmacy in one plant. E. Sivakova, a factory worker with 2 young daughters, wrote a personal account of her quest in Rabotnitsa. "The soil was hard. We ploughed the virgin soil with horses, tractors, and forks." Following a night shift at the factory with only a couple of hours' sleep in her, Sivakova would head to the garden to work. "Once in the fresh air, all the tiredness disappears," she wrote. By 1945, Soviet official records registered 18.5 million kitchen gardens. Moscow's alone produced 10,000 boxcars worth of vegetables. Potatoes in overwhelming quantities, along with carrots, beetroots, cabbages, beans, and peas. The Soviet states suppressed stories about the less triumphant side of the kitchen garden movement, the scrounging for tools and supplies, and the proliferation of private markets that many gardeners turned to for a little money on the side. Where the conditions of life had been obliterated by fire and by bombs, there remained defiant, snaking fringes of green. As rice rations shrunk in Japan in 1944 and 1945, as fish disappeared from people's bowls, desperate urban residents planted the edges of railway tracks with wheat, barley, potatoes, and yams. And in Japanese-occupied Southeast Asia, where food distribution had collapsed amid a rampant black market, no patch of soil was wasted. Yap Song-yu, who lived through the war in Singapore, remembered that people planted tapioca everywhere, even along the edges of stormwater drains. The enterprising boss at the Ban Hin Lee Bank, where Yap worked, reared chickens for eggs in the firm's kitchen. When official routes of supply failed, informal ones stepped in. Yap's customers smuggled him red beans for protein to supplement the meager diet of kangkong and gruel served by the employee's kitchen. On lucky days, pieces of bean curd and leftover pork were purloined from Japanese military kitchens. A Japanese soldier, a sympathetic character as Yap, remembered him, had a habit of poking his sword into the bags of rice that he deposited in the bank's vaults. He did this as if accidentally, allowing some precious grains to spill out to be swept up by employees. One country stood alone. As Europe and Asia burned, the United States mainland was unscathed. As Asia and Europe battled hunger, American farms produced more than they ever had. Many social groups in America ate better during the war than they had in the lean years of the Depression. American agriculture was productive enough to supply vital grain, meat, and fats to Britain and the Soviet Union through the Lend-Lease scheme. The United States produced a tenth of all the food in the world by 1945. America's wartime abundance of food had a hidden side. Farmers struggled to meet the surge in demand for vegetables and fruits. A tenth of the agricultural output of California before the war had come from Japanese-American farms. They ceased production after February 1942 because 112,000 people of Japanese origin, 79,000 of them American citizens, were forced to leave their homes and were imprisoned in camps in Arizona, Washington, Oregon, and California. To take their place and to replace farm workers serving in the military, the U.S. government made a deal with the Mexican government. hundreds of thousands of short-term contract workers crossed the border to work on American farms and on the railroads beginning in 1942. The bracero program took its name from a Mexican word for a manual worker, and it would outlast the war. Many braceros spoke of the privations and indignities of their lives through analogies with animals, akin to the experiences of so many others caught up in the war. At the labor depot, Isidoro Ramirez recalled, "They put you up against the wall, and the contractors came like they were coming to buy livestock. Como a ir a comprar ganado." Cecilio Santiano described workers being packed into freight cars, like sheep, up to El Paso. Chemical pesticides coated the bodies of migrant workers. They sprayed us like rats, like insects. Non espregan como ratones, así como insectos. Isaiah Sanchez remembered, "We left covered in powder." Along with human and animal bodies, swathes of America's farmland were now covered in powder, coated with chemical insecticides. The war boom inaugurated the oil age in U.S. agriculture. Petroleum drove motorized tractors. Petroleum drove Massey Harris self-propelled combine harvesters. Petroleum drove aircraft that rained pesticides and fungicides upon the soil. A breakthrough in refrigeration revolutionized food preservation. Seabrook Farms of New Jersey, the largest agricultural firm in America, adopted Charles Birdseye's freezing technology at scale, to the benefit of America's allies as well as domestic consumers. Changes in the crop mix of American agriculture cast a long shadow. The area planted with soy in Illinois more than doubled. After the war, soy became dominant in animal feed on both sides of the Atlantic, and it became the crucial ingredient in processed foods. The productive power of the US economy was the deciding factor in the outcome of the war, and so in the future of the world. "We will emerge from this struggle as the dominant power," declared Ralph Watkins of the US National Resource Planning Board in November 1942. Dominant in naval power, dominant in air power, dominant in industrial capacity, dominant in mineral production, dominant in agricultural production. Zoologist Henry Baldwin Ward was one of the few people to voice concern about the consequences of that dominance for what he called the living and non-living materials that nature furnishes in the vast and little understood complex we call the environment. Ward trained at Williams and Harvard, and in the late 1880s he studied at Germany's premier universities, Leipzig, Göttingen, and Freiburg. He taught high school science back in the United States, and then moved to university positions in Michigan, Nebraska, and finally at the University of Illinois. Before an audience at the Texas Academy of Science in November 1942, Ward raised the threat of extinction amid mobilization for war. "Living things are easily destroyed," he said, "and once a particular type has been exterminated, it cannot be restored." Ward narrated to his listeners a stylized history of the American frontier, the same story that Hitler and Himmler were so fond of telling. And although he embraced the notion that hardy white settlers had rightfully dispossessed indigenous people, Ward drew a darker lesson. America's bounty was not infinite, Ward thought. More than one half of the natural resources that the continent originally possessed had disappeared within the first 250 years of our history. Ward's deepest fear was that war is a carnival of waste. In America, the war might bring enormous, disastrous, environmental consequences, he thought, but not annihilating ones, while in Europe, destruction has already gone to an extreme. Whatever the post-war order looked like, Ward foresaw it would demand the extensive restoration of nature's ruins. Students of the American war effort are mesmerized by it, even now. One must risk hyperbole, economic historian Jonathan Levy writes, for the war brought the United States global economic preeminence on a scale unmatched in history. Jill Lepore conveys the same sense of awe through numbers. During the war, American workers built 300,000 aircraft, 86,000 tanks, 3 million machine guns, and 71,000 ships. During the war, the United States produced half the coal and 2/3 of the oil in the world. The federal government invested $70 billion in aerospace, arms, and electronics to propel another spurt of American industrialization, this time on the Pacific coast. The marriage of advanced scientific research and industrial capacity gave the United States its unassailable edge in destructive power. Nowhere more than at the Los Alamos laboratory where, in secret amid the high mesas, inspired by daily walks amid the pines and a view of the Sangre de Cristo range, Berkeley physicist Robert Oppenheimer coordinated the Manhattan Project to produce the atomic bomb. When the Manhattan Project team witnessed the test explosion they conducted on July 16, 1945, they turned not to the language of military industrial might, but to expressions of awe at the unnatural power of what they had unleashed. "I thought that the explosion might set fire to the atmosphere and finish the earth," Emilio Segre wrote. Oppenheimer, a student of Sanskrit, recalled that at the moment of the explosion a line from the Bhagavad Gita came to him. "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Twinned with the power of destruction, the strength and success of the American war effort lay in its construction of a new infrastructure of life support. The United States built runways to airlift supplies, pipelines to move oil, and factories to freeze vegetables. The clothing of American soldiers was coated with a new substance, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, DDT, which insulated their bodies from insects. Aerial spraying of DDT moved from individual bodies to whole ecosystems to create zones of perceived human safety from malaria in the tropics. Satisfied US military medical officers found that DDT was still killing weeks after the first application. The technological struggle against hunger was manifest in every rectangular tin of Spam, chopped up pork mixed with salt, water, potato starch, sugar, and preserved in sodium nitrate to make a pink oleaginous meat, shipped to every theatre of war in a triumph of global logistics and imprinted on the culinary memories of people around the world. "Without Spam, we wouldn't have been able to feed our army," Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev later recalled. "It tasted good," he added. Across the Pacific, wherever US troops went, Spam remained. Hawaii soul food, a local food writer would call it, still in the 21st century. In the mountainous, forested terrain between India, Burma, and China, the wartime quest to dominate natural environments reached a limit. The last 3 years of the war saw brutal struggles to stamp infrastructure onto unyielding landscapes. First the Japanese and then the Americans confronted the unfinished business of 19th century colonization. They dusted off plans for roads and rail tracks that had been abandoned, now hastily revived, to create supply corridors. The Japanese military forced the construction of a rail line from Thailand to Burma in 1942, using 60,000 Allied prisoners of war and 200,000 Asian workers to hack through teak forest. They built 600 bridges, viaducts, and embankments over the rivered ground to support a 250-mile stretch of rail. "The Japanese did not give me a proper shirt or blanket for 7 months, testified a Tamil plantation worker in Malaya who had been bundled into a Japanese truck at gunpoint and forced to work on the railway. An estimated 90,000 Asian workers and 16,000 Allied prisoners of war died in the effort. Richard Middleton Smith, a private in the Straits Settlements Volunteer Force and a fluent Tamil speaker, noted in his diary, scrawled on the squared paper of school exercise books and on the backs of account ledgers, the large number of railway workers who staggered into relief camps at the war's end, having been forced to spend agonizing days clearing the jungle to build a camp of sorts. After the loss of the Burma Road to Japanese conquest in 1942, treacherous high-altitude flight over the Himalayas, the Hump it was called, was the only way the Americans could keep Chinese allies supplied. To build a supplementary land route, 15,000 US soldiers, more than half of them African-American, worked alongside 35,000 Asians, not all of them there willingly. Bengalis from the tea plantations of Assam, Garo porters, Indian and Chinese soldiers all joined in the effort. To American planners, it all seemed a stretch too far, even with all the tools at their disposal. The jungle is not an exotic green wilderness of gigantic trees, rare flowering plants, swarms of monkeys swinging from the vines, writhing snakes and vicious animals, a US Army report warned. It was worse than that. The jungle, in reality, is tall and dark and silent as death. The troops and engineers soon found that the jungle was not quite silent, just a decibel away from silence. There were the buzzes and hums and whirs of the insects, which died by the thousands every night. Assailed by winged tormentors, their clothes stinking of insecticide, insulation was for the troops a distant dream. General Vinegar Joe Stilwell's 1,000-mile road to link northeastern India to the Burma Road, connecting Burma and China, was built in 2 years. In aerial photographs, the road looks like part of the landscape, embedded in the mountains and with no sense of what it had taken to create it. Lord Louis Mountbatten, commander of the Allied Southeast Asia Command, is said to have asked, the first time he flew over the Lido Road, what river it was that he saw glinting in the sun. Convoys of trucks began to cross it in January 1945. Over the next 6 months, they carried 129,000 tons of military and civilian supplies. Aircraft carried significantly more. The road was always secondary to the air corridor, which escaped the terrestrial threats of the jungle altogether. It is hard to say which mattered more for what was to come, the speed with which the road was built, or the haste with which it was jettisoned. By January 1946, the British government of Burma would write to London that, "We understand that US forces have already abandoned it, or are on the point of doing so." 4 decades later, American zoologist and big cat conservationist Alan Rabinowitz, who had obtained special permission from the junta to study the region in the 1980s, when Burma was closed to the world, described the ruins of the Great Lido Road. Skeletons of bridges, along with miles of old rusting pipe, battered oil drums, and numerous unrecognizable pieces of military hardware, now taken over by jungle. The Japanese-Burma Railway, which extinguished so many lives, suffered the same fate. In The Narrow Road to the Deep North, in which he imagines the experience of Australian prisoners of war on the railway, novelist Richard Flanagan describes the ruins of the railroad with taut ambivalence. A rampant, hopeful recolonization by nature of the human wreckage, and an appalling erasure of human suffering through neglect. The line welcomed rain and sun. Seeds germinated in mass graves between skulls and femurs and broken pick handles. Amid the war's powers of human and more than human destruction, the possibility of life, of survival and renewal lay in cultivating the ruins of nature by the sides of ditches and in straggly blotches of green among shattered cityscapes. To claim human freedom was to reclaim kinship with the natural world. Today, in this place, our only purpose is to reach the spring, Primo Levi recalled as he brought vividly to life a day in the camp when the sun rose bright and clear for the first time from the horizon of mud. It was a faint sun, cold, white, and distant, but it was enough that a murmur ran through our colourless numbers. By contrast, the camp of Buna, where the prisoners were forced to work, was a huge entanglement of iron, concrete, mud, and smoke. In every way, the negation of beauty. On the camp's grounds, Levi wrote, "Not a blade of grass grows, and the soil is impregnated with the poisonous saps of coal and petroleum, and the only things alive are machines and slaves." To cling to one's humanity was to cling to a sense of communion, glimpsed or remembered with the rest of nature. 7:09 a.m., August the 6th, 1945. Fair weather, ready for air raid. Just over an hour later, Little Boy heated the air to several million degrees centigrade at the moment it exploded at 8:15 a.m., 1,800 feet above the ground. The thermal flash that accompanied the bomb's detonation killed 70,000 people in an instant. Its impact touched almost every form of life. Birds dropped from the sky, hemorrhaging and denuded of feathers. At a stables near the hypercenter of the blast, 120 of 184 horses died. The equine survivors suffered burns, leukopenia, and suppurative conjunctivitis. Death mirrored art in trees that stood like cubist paintings. The face turned toward the explosion was blistered and bare. The other was undisturbed, green and profuse with branches. Earthworms barely noticed the blast. All around them, the roots and stalks of plants survived, underground. At 9 o'clock on that morning of fair weather, rain started to fall. Black rain. Mutant raindrops gathered and disgorged the remnants of fire that whirled through city streets at a rate of 18 meters per second. Kimura Yasuko, who had been evacuated to a temple in the hills under the strict care of nuns, gazed down on what remained of her city. The ruins from an ordinary fire are burned black, aren't they? She mused many years later. But the ruins of Hiroshima were brown, the color of unfired pottery. The uranium bomb unleashed by American forces on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and the even more powerful plutonium bomb on Nagasaki 3 days later brought about the total disintegration of human life. At the end of a war that had stripped the earth of wood and ore and grain, at the end of a war that had forged new technologies of mass destruction, all that remained was the fragile creatureliness of the human body. So thin was the protective layer of skin that flapped or peeled in strips from people's bodies as they ran from the flames. So hallowed was the sensation common to all animals, the relief of water upon dry lips. But this water was radioactive. The direct effects of the bomb, thermal injuries, blast injuries, radiation injuries, killed 140,000 people in Hiroshima and 70,000 in Nagasaki. For those who lived, the trauma continued. Radiation stained the soil and water, causing a surge in leukemia, in thyroid and breast and throat cancers, in microcephaly in infants. Radiation destroyed the reparative and regenerative processes of the living body for years, for decades afterward. President Harry S. Truman and US military leaders justified the atomic bombs as a necessary evil to end a war that had cost tens of millions of lives. The terrible swiftness of destruction, they argued, saved many lives that would have been lost in a ground invasion of Japan. Ever since the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, others have been skeptical. Japan was on its knees and close to surrender, critics say. The United States used the atomic bomb to demonstrate to the world, and in particular to the Soviet Union, that it commanded powers of earthly destruction without precedent. In the last 2 years of the war, even before the atomic bombs crossed a final threshold of ruin, Allied militaries wielded sufficient force to make an unnatural weather phenomenon, the firestorm. In the last week of July 1943, the Royal Air Force dropped so many bombs and incendiary devices on the city of Hamburg that hundreds of fires fused together in an 800-degree cyclone that devoured 256,000 dwellings, left 40,000 people dead, and injured more than 100,000 others. Aerial attacks on Dresden followed between February 13th to 15th, 1945. The US Bombing Survey reported firestorms occurred, the violent fires generating a violent hurricane-like draft, which fed other fires and made all attempts at control hopeless. After 2 nights, all that remained of large parts of the city hung heavy in the air as clouds of smoke. Tokyo suffered the most devastating attack of all. As they contemplated the destruction of Japan's capital city, US military planners predicted a degree of destruction never before equaled. They estimated that 500,000 people would die in a city where 90% of homes were made of wood. The night of March the 9th, 1945, America B-29 bombers unleashed 1,665 tons of bombs, a great mushroom of boiling oily smoke, upon Tokyo. Many were cluster bombs, and each released a flurry of smaller devices a couple of thousand feet above the ground. The bomblets were filled with a substance discovered by Harvard chemists only 3 years earlier, a mixture of naphthenic and palmitic acids, their opening syllables squashed to make napalm. Explosive compounds in the bombs ignited phosphorus, which burned hot enough in turn to ignite the napalm, a flammable gelatinous liquid that adhered to the exposed surfaces of wooden houses and tarred roads and human bodies. Napalm burns, blasts, asphyxiates its victims. When Tomie Akazawa spoke of the storm that had deranged everything, the detail that remained was the tremendous updrafts that lifted from our shoulders the quilts with which we tried to protect ourselves. That night, in that man-made weather, more than 100,000 people died. 1 million lost their homes. In every fire of 1944 and 1945, there were echoes of earlier fires lit by German and Japanese dreams of world conquest. The fires across the frozen waste of Stalingrad, leaving an enormous cloud of burning, blinding smoke. The fires that obliterated the Arctic port city of Murmansk, bombed by German forces in June 1942. The fires that ate at the city of Chongqing, which Japanese forces bombed again and again from 1939 to 1944. The fires of Manila in 1945, where 100,000 Filipinos died amid the Japanese army's last acts of self-immolation. The fires that fed the crematoria of Auschwitz-Birkenau, where at least 1.1 million Jewish people were killed in gas chambers, among the 6 million murdered in the Holocaust. Scientists have estimated that wartime fires emitted more than 500 million kilograms of soot into the atmosphere in 1944 and 1945, enough, in theory, to reduce the solar radiation reaching Earth's surface, though it has not been possible to demonstrate any clear impact of the Second World War on global climate. Even if the war's climatic signature cannot be proven, that such colossal impact is even plausible marks the dawn of a planetary power beyond comprehension. The iconic photograph of the Hiroshima explosion, taken with a handheld camera by the Enola Gay's tail gunner George Caron, shows an unnatural sky, a billowing mushroom cloud that engulfs the natural cloud forms around and beneath it. Years after the war, a group of Japanese scientists, doctors, and citizens constituted the Committee for the Compilation of Materials on Damage Caused by the Atomic Bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a prosaic name for an endeavor of lasting moral power and intellectual rigor. Only occasionally does the plain restraint of the committee's prose give way to something closer to anger. As the committee searched for words to describe the crimes of August the 6th and 9th, 1945, they chose genocide, ecocide, biocide, earthicide. In this combination of horrors lies a new way to see not only the atomic bombings but the entirety of the Second World War, as the dark culmination of a century-long history that saw the twinned acceleration of both human and environmental destruction.